Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at the creation of game utilities with our game map by fixing some bugs and adding a few enhancements. This was our application at the end of the last video. Regardless of how long you've been coding in any particular programming language, there comes a time when you have to fix bugs. Bugs, of course, are unwanted functionality. Either the application is doing something incorrectly, or is doing something unexpected. And then to correct the problem, you have to do some investigation. Once you complete your investigation, you should have a good idea of what's causing the problem. This will, of course, require changing either data or code or both. The first thing we're going to investigate is a problem with moving players around the map. If we load up our application, load up the world map, process the first turn, we can see all the players on the map marked as red. If we click the process bulk turns, we'll see that the players move around the map. However, they're supposed to do this in a random fashion. But there is something not quite right with the direction that the players are actually moving. They're in fact all moving in the same direction more or less at the same time. So there's something wrong with the process by which we get the direction in which players are supposed to move. So in order to fix this bug or feature, let's have a look at the code. So here we have the main move rulers function. This function runs in a for next loop for each ruler, each character within the application, to determine what they're going to do in the way of movement. Within this for next loop, there is a single function called getDirection. This is to determine the delta x and delta y, which direction the player is actually going to be moving. If we have a look at the getDirection function, we will see that the delta x and delta y are determined using the rnd command, the random command, pulling back a value between -1 and +1. It's embedded in a while loop to ensure that the x and y deltas are not going to be both 0, and it will run on a loop until the player's character is moving in one direction or another, but not staying in the same terrain. However, there's a flaw in this logic. There is nothing necessarily wrong with this particular function. However, the values we're passing in should initially be 0. If we look at move rulers once more, we'll see that within this for next loop, these two values are not reinitialized, and this is our problem. Once these values have been populated, the function we're calling the getDirection will only trigger if both values are 0. So what we need to do is to initialize these to 0 before we call getDirection. This way, the function should behave normally. So let's try running the application now to see how it looks. We will load our map. We will process the first turn to place the rulers on the map, and we will do a process bulk turns, which is going to run for 50 iterations. And we can now see that the characters are moving in a fairly random direction each time they are run. They're not all going in the same direction. So that's our first bug actually fixed. The next thing we're going to look at is how the characters move around the map and how they build their empires. We can see from this corner of the map, the player has a number of terrains. It now has 11 terrains set up. We've also got the terrain navigation buttons at the bottom here. As we will see, we're currently on 35.6 as coordinates with owner number 9. If we move one to the right, these numbers are not being updated, nor are the owner details, despite the fact that we're now moving away from the original location. So we'll need to update both the x and y coordinates and the owner details. Also, the terrain we are centered on is not indicated on this mini-map, which would be ideal to give a bit more clarity. So let's go back to the code and correct these problems. If we look at the terrain info function, this is a function that displays this map on the screen. Once the dialog has been created, there is a series of lines of code following that to pick up the owner, to work out whether the owner is active, and to display this to the user on screen. So this is how this information gets initially populated. But the problem is, when you move around the map using the navigation buttons, these details are not updated. So we'll need to duplicate this functionality elsewhere in the application on the button click events. So the easiest way to do this is to take the code we see on screen here and turning it into a function. And we'll call that function from several places within the application. So for the moment, we're going to comment out all of this code in here, and we're going to put it into its own function. And we're going to call this new function update terrain details. And we're going to pass 3 parameters to this new function: the dialog handle and the x and y coordinates that the user is currently at. So let's go and create this new function. So here is the skeleton of our new function, update terrain details, taking in its 3 parameters. We're going to create a number of local variables to allow us to perform this task. We've got a variable called owner, which is going to be our owner's number. We're also going to hold that as a string. And we have owner details to contain the information we display at the bottom of the dialog. And we're also using a temporary string variable. So our first task is to pick up the owner of the current terrain, based on the x and the y coordinates. Then we're going to determine whether the owner is a value of 0 or not. If the owner value is 0, then there is no current owner of the territory. Otherwise, we're picking up the owner's number and putting it into our string variable. Now we're going to start populating the str value variable to say if the owner is active or not, and whether the terrain has an owner or not. We can now use our rulers array to determine whether the owner is actually in the territory or not. And we will start populating the owner details variable. This is what's going to appear in the text box at the bottom of the dialog. And now that we've amassed all this information, we're going to continue to update the owner details with the number of territories the owner actually possesses. So this function will be called when the dialog is initially displayed to the user. However, in addition to that, we need to actually go into the event handler, the callback function for this dialog. Here, the clicking on the north, south, east or west buttons can be trapped, and we're going to call this function inside those events. So let's have a look at that callback function. So here is our callback function. If we move further down the code, we can see here are the buttons for image north, south, and so on. So after we've copied the small map from the big dialog to the small one, we're going to call this new function. And there is our call to the update terrain function, passing it the 3 parameters: the handle of the dialog we're currently on, the x and y coordinates. So we're going to duplicate this for each of these buttons, the north, south, east and west. And there are the entries to call this new function. So if we try running the application once more, loading up our map, processing our first turn, and doing some bulk turns. So now that's completed, let's have a look at the smaller dialog. We can see we're on x equals 31 and y equals 5. If we move one terrain to the right, to the east, it now moves to 32. And the detail at the bottom of the screen has also been updated, which is ideal. However, the one thing we're still missing is knowing exactly which terrain this map refers to. So that's our next task. This is additional functionality we wish to add, perhaps with a small circle around the terrain we're currently on. And I think it's probably that one. So let's have a look at the code to see how we can actually do that. So where in the code do we actually need to make this change? There is a section of the code which copies the small map from the large dialog to the smaller one. So this is in a function called copy small map. And in here, this is where the graphics copy command is used to copy a section of the large graphics terrain map to the small graphics control on our new dialog. So following the display of this small graphics map, we now want to draw a circle around the center terrain. So we'll need to work out exactly which terrain that actually is. So we're going to create two local variables, an X terrain and a Y terrain. And these, when populated, will be used to mark which terrain we're actually going to draw a circle around. So we work on the assumption that the terrain is likely to be near the very centre of our graphics map. So we'll take the size of the graphics map, which was determined up here using the graphics set size command, and we will divide it by 2 as an integer division. This will give us a whole number. And we will subtract from that the size of the box. This is a box which determines how big each of the terrains actually is on screen. So now that we've determined roughly where the center terrain actually is, we're going to use the graphics ellipse command to draw on screen a circle. And then we can use the existing graphics redraw command to display this to the user. So this is determined by the top left hand and bottom right hand boundings of our circle as a square. So we're using X and Y terrain, and we're adding on to that the box size. We're making the circumference of our circle in yellow. We're using -2 to ensure that what's underneath the circle shows through, and we're setting the fill to be 0. So let's try running that code now. So let's try with one of the players near the edge of the terrain. Now, we're very close to having this correct. We have our circle on screen, but it's not quite centered over the terrain we want to have. So possibly 1 or 2 pixels out. So we will come out and we'll make a small adjustment to these X and Y coordinates. Now let's try running that now to see if that's giving us a better location. And we'll again go for one on the terrain near the sea. And there we have our yellow circle circling very close to the center of what we've clicked on. It's not quite in the center of the map, but it is circling the terrain we have actually clicked on. And if we move to the right, it is of course now obvious which terrain we're talking about. So if we go into this one here, it's now picking up the owner. And if we go here, it's picking up the other owner. So this circle on the small graphics map is very useful. The next thing we want to look at is how the characters in this simulation actually build their empires. One thing I've noticed is that depending on how they move, they can wander into other territories, and if we click on one of these, we will see that this particular ruler has 8 territories. Now it's not particularly obvious which 8 territories these actually are, and I suspect in some cases there are rulers who have larger territories, but these territories are not joined together. So we need to find a way of allowing the users to more intelligently expand their empires. Now you could do this by some really fancy AI routines, or we could just be more careful about how the rulers actually move around the map. So on the assumption that we want to make the change to the code as simple from a maintenance point of view as possible, let's have a look at just changing how they move. So again, we're going to be looking at the move rulers function. So in here, we have the section of the code which determines where the ruler moves. And below this is the section which works out is the terrain already owned and works out whether there needs to be a battle or not. So this is where I want to put the new piece of code, and we're going to box this in a new function. And we're going to call this new function terrain adjacent. This will work out as the terrain adjacent to an existing owned territory. So we're going to pass 3 variables to this: the X and Y coordinates we're planning to move to, and the long R, which in this case is the ruler number. So let's create this new function. So here's the skeleton of our new function taking the 3 parameters. The X and Y variables is where they are going to be moving to, and long R is the player number. So we're creating some local variables to allow us to work out what we're doing. So first of all, we will pick up the current location of the player, the X and Y coordinates. We can pull this out quite happily from the rulers array, where the locations of all the players are actually stored. So first we will test the x and y coordinates that the user is moving to against where they currently are. If all the values are the same, then the player is not moving. So we'll return a function equals true. So if this is not true, then the player is definitely moving. So next we have to determine whether the terrain the user is moving into is actually adjacent to one which they already own. And we're going to use an if command here with a number of else if conditions. And we can use the owner map to determine whether this terrain is owned by the user or not. So first of all, we're looking at the y coordinate -1. If that matches, then our return from this function is true. And we're going to do the same for each of the conditions we're looking for. So we're specifically looking for where the y coordinate is plus or -1 and the x coordinate is plus or -1. Everything else will return the value false. So now that we have that in place, let's try running our application once more. We will load our map up, we will process the first turn, and we will process some bulk turns. This will give us 50 iterations of the empire building. Now, as we can see, the rulers are not wandering off diagonally, and they're only expanding their empire based on terrain which is adjacent to existing terrain. So this should actually save our rulers wandering into other territories and then disconnecting from their existing empires. So we can see if we click on any of these, this particular ruler has 24 territories. And if we try for one of the larger ones, this has 35 territories. As we move further into the simulation, processing additional bulk turns, we can see whether the rulers start to steal territory from each other, for example, down here. So now the building of rulers' territories now seems to be more logical. There might be more needed within the code to make the users more realistically in building empires. However, this is a major step forward on what we've had before. So in summary, what we've done today is we've fixed a bug with movement of rulers. We've also enhanced it slightly to allow the terrain map, when clicked upon, to give you a little yellow circle circling the area we're now looking at. And the detail within this terrain information dialog is now being updated when you move around the map. Hopefully you'll have found this video interesting, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.